let's kick off. A very warm welcome to everyone to this public lecture. This public lecture is part of the Festival of Ideas organized by the institutes here at Edge Hill University, and we are sponsored right here tonight by the institute, well, the I4P. I try not to spell it out. I4P is way too long for me. But a great thanks to Jon Diamond, who's here tonight as well, and Danny, who's been organizing the event as well, for sponsoring this event. This public lecture is really a culmination of the work I've been doing on Edge Hill. I've been doing with the International Foundation for Integrated Care, and the International Foundation has been working with us to create some sort of like online resource, learning resource on integrated care. And Jon and his colleagues and some international experts have worked with us to conduct and record some webinars, and they're all online. So if you're interested in integrated care, it's really a fantastic online resource that's now online. It's 6 webinars, and you can just type in International Foundation for Integrated Care and Edge Hill University, and you'll probably see the 6 webinars. And hopefully we're going to have this public lecture also online very soon. So coming on to this lecture here tonight, I think I'm absolutely delighted really to have a real expert in integrated care, especially integrated care in health and social care here tonight, Professor Jon Glasby. Jon is the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Integrated Care, and he has been, between 2008 and 2015, the director of the Health Services Management Center in Birmingham, and is now the head of social policy school at the University of Birmingham. So without further ado, a very, very warm welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Axel. And thanks everyone for inviting me to be here tonight. I'm really impressed with your dedication, actually, that you chose to come to a lecture on integrated care rather than going to the football. And as a lifelong Liverpool fan who grew up in the southwest of England, being this close to the football but not actually able to go is a little galling, I have to say, although I think the train back takes me close to the ground, which is something. I wanted to talk about the current integrated care agenda in England, but really an agenda that's throughout the UK and indeed most developed health and social care systems, which are trying to find ways of responding to population change and other changes in society by more formally and more fully integrating their health and social care systems. I trained as a social worker initially, but before that I was a history student. It's not necessarily a conventional career route, but I often think that trying to understand where we've come from is quite a good way of understanding where we genuinely are now and where we might be headed in future. So although it seems a slightly odd place to start, I wanted to begin just very briefly with the 1942 Beveridge Report on social insurance and allied services. And when we published the Beveridge Report in 1942, ordinary members of the public queued around the block in order to buy a copy of the report. I don't know if that happened here when we published the recent white paper, but in 1942 we were all on the street queuing up to buy a copy of Beveridge. We were still at war, so we flew in copies for soldiers who were serving overseas. We made $5,000 out of the Americans who were interested in this international example of good practice in terms of reforming welfare services. When the Allies invaded Berlin, they found a copy of the Beveridge Report in Hitler's bunker that had been personally annotated by Hitler himself. Although when you read the annotations, Hitler saw Beveridge as proof that Britain was about to adopt Nazi principles. So the extent to which he'd fully understood it, I think, is open to historical question. Beveridge himself was seen as a national hero. He was invited to speak at events like this one throughout the country. It's even said that on a Clapham omnibus, a conductor who saw a passenger with a copy of the Beveridge Report under his arm wouldn't let the passenger onto the bus until he promised to lend the conductor his copy of Beveridge, so that the conductor too could read it in the original. More than any other document, it's something that fundamentally changed the nature of welfare services in this country in a way that more recent reforms have probably struggled to do. Now, one of the things that Beveridge did very early on in that report, in quite a famous passage, is identify what he described as 5 giants or serious social problems that a welfare state was meant to resolve? It's a very unfair question at this time of the evening, but can anyone remember any of the 5 giants? Want is in there, very good. Yep. Oh, you're on fire. I'll give everyone else a clue. One of them's ignorance, but carry on. To be fair, I can never remember when I'm asked on the spur of the moment, and I have previously presented this example to a ministerial working group on health and social care integration. I have to say they didn't know all 5 of the 5 giants either, although to be fair, we did say that the minister didn't have to answer the question because clearly he'd know, and we didn't want him to embarrass his policy aides. So if you are asked, here's a pictorial representation. We have the giant of want, or of poverty, and here is Oliver Twist famously asking for some more. We've got the giant of disease that I suppose I was hoping an NHS audience would edge its way towards. We've got a giant of idleness. We've got the giant of ignorance. And then a slightly older slide, if you remember back this far, we've got the giant of squalor, if you remember back to Harry Enfield as Wayne and Waynetta Slob. Or if you need a mental image to try and remember all 5, we use this one. Now, those kind of terms are very dated, and in many cases they're really offensive. You wouldn't use that kind of language now. But the problems that we identified in the 1940s, I think, are still with us, albeit under new language, as are many of the structures and the responses that we created. So want in 1940s language becomes poverty or social exclusion, and we've dealt with it in various ways, but often through the social security system. Disease has been the responsibility of the NHS. So-called ignorance we've tended to deal with through education, but also with notions of lifelong learning. So-called idleness we've tended to deal with mainly through employment, although sometimes recognising that people also need access to meaningful leisure and recreation. And then so-called squalor we've often responded to through housing initially, but then over time maybe through regeneration or economic development or neighbourhood renewal. Now, one of the interesting things for me as a former social worker is I've never quite been clear where social care and social work fits on that slide. I don't know if it responds to a 6th giant that we didn't identify in 1942. I don't know if it's a kind of crisis service that meets the needs of people who've fallen through the gaps in the other services, and or whether it's some kind of glue that holds the rest of the system together. But for me, one of the reasons why social care at a national level anyway has sometimes suffered from something of a crisis of confidence in recent years, I think I'd argue, is partly because it's been quite hard to articulate how and where it fits in that post-war welfare structure. Now, arising out of that, you get a very hierarchical, top-down kind of system. You've got a single government department responsible for each giant, and it's got its own regional mechanisms and its own local delivery units. And I've started to draw health and social security on the slide behind me, but it could have been any of the 5. The names of these things change over time. The relationship between the local and the regional and national comes and goes. But actually, if you drew the chart at any stage over the last 50, 60 years, it would look a bit like that. It would be very neat, it would be very boxed, it would be very linear. And of course, we've been learning ever since that it bears no relation to how people actually live their lives. Real life is just more complicated and more messy than the systems and the structures that we create in our organisational charts. And from probably 1997 in particular onwards, we've been trying to experiment with something different. And here we've got the person in the middle who's now a citizen, actually not just a passive recipient of other people's services. And we've got different welfare agencies and professions who are meant to fit in around the needs and the requirements of the individual, rather than the other way round, the individual meant to slot themselves into the needs and the requirements of the different agencies. Again, the language has changed. We've talked about person-centred services and coordinated care and partnership working and integrated care and joined-up solutions to joined-up problems and so on and so forth. But the aspiration has often been the same. The difficulty, I think, is that pretty much everything that we've inherited still looks and feels like the previous slide. Different organisational structures with different legal frameworks, with different budgetary processes, with different IT systems, with different ways of training and educating practitioners and managers, with different approaches to whether or not things are free or means tested, covering different geographical areas and so on and so forth. Almost all of our history is very silo-based and divided, and yet you and colleagues elsewhere are being asked to take that very divided history and turn it into something that looks and feels much more person-centred and much more joined up, for frontline staff, and more importantly for people who use services and their families. And if that sometimes feels very difficult and frustrating, it's basically because it is. Policymakers, I suspect, don't always realise quite how difficult the task that they've set us is. Ours is a task of historic translation, taking a system that was very divided and trying to turn it into something much more person-centred at local level. And for people who are interested, there's quite a well-known article, which I think you can download for free, called The 5 Laws of Integration, one of which is that you can't integrate a square peg into a round hole. And I'm afraid one of the tasks that we've been set, relatively explicitly actually, is to integrate a fairly square peg into a round hole. That's the nature of the challenge that we face. Now, moving on from that brief sort of introduction around the history, where we've come from, how we got to where we are now, I wanted to share one thing that I don't think will work and 3 or 4 things that might. And I probably wouldn't put it any more in any stronger way than that, because the evidence base probably isn't strong enough to say. But from both the research, from other countries, and from policy and practice experience, I think I'd like to suggest one thing that won't work and 3 or 4 things that might. Before at the end of the session, we then throw it open for debate and questions. And the one thing that won't work by itself is relying primarily on organisational and structural change to try and join up our services and to produce more coordinated care. There's quite a large literature now on mergers and acquisitions, both in public services and in the commercial sector, where mergers and acquisitions are much more common. And all that evidence over time has suggested that mergers and acquisitions by themselves rarely achieve stated objectives. They typically don't save money. In the commercial sector, some 50 to 70% of mergers and acquisitions fail. They go bankrupt or they get broken up and sold on shortly afterwards. Now, by definition, if some 50-odd% don't work, that implies that some 50-odd% do work. So there's obviously some learning that we can take from those positive examples. But often, merging structures doesn't save money. And typically, it doesn't save it in the short term. And another of those 5 laws of integration is that integration often costs before it pays. And I think if it was me, I'd add a little bracket in there as well, that integration often costs before it pays, brackets, and we typically never stick at anything long enough to work out whether it ever really pays, close brackets. What mergers and acquisitions do, you'll be pleased to know, is reduce morale and productivity. Normally for about 18 months to 2 years after the change that you make, if you manage that change well. If you don't manage that change well, the negative effects can last a lot longer. And there may well be colleagues in the room who've worked in organisations or systems that have previously merged, and you can still feel, and you're still working through the after effects of some of those processes, sometimes 5-10 years after the original merger or acquisition. Reconciling different cultures is a key part of that, and I'll come on to the issue of culture, organisational and professional culture, in a moment. What mergers and acquisitions also do is stall positive service development, often for about 18 months or so, we think. So if you have to go through all the complexity of merging structures, if we decided to create an integrated organisation tonight, just the people in the room, we'd probably do nothing else for the next 18 months or so, other than work out how to organise ourselves and what we call ourselves. And we'd have to harmonise our terms and conditions. We would reallocate car parking spaces. We'd have to do something about signage and IT. You know, all the things that you have to do when you're creating new organisational entities, and all important in their own right, but nothing that improves quality and responsiveness for people using services in the here and now. What mergers and acquisitions also achieve is what the literature very politely describes as regime change, which is code for getting rid of chief executives and management teams that are deemed to be failing. Now, we could have a broader conversation about what constitutes failure and who decides, and there are other ways of doing that. But in the NHS, in terms of hospital mergers, the evidence has suggested that many of our previous mergers and acquisitions haven't taken place for the reasons stated in the consultation document. I'm sure that will shock this audience profoundly. They tend to take place, NHS mergers, for 3 reasons. 1, in response to national or local politics. 2, to save money, even though typically they don't. And 3, to get rid of management teams that are deemed to be failing. Now, none of this is to say that structural change can't be part of a bigger solution. It's just that often it isn't, in my experience, and even when it is, it's because there are other things going on above and beyond the structural change. So if nothing else as a result of tonight, we should be really cautious and careful about the law, but the danger of looking to structural and merger-based solutions. They tend not to solve the underlying problems by themselves. Just as an aside, when we were carrying out some of this research, I was approached by a different coalition government that was based in Basra Palace in Iraq to see if we'd be involved in helping to rebuild the Iraqi healthcare system after the conflict. Shortly afterwards, we got approached by Iran, and colleagues tell me that academic notions of regime change have very different connotations in those countries. And for a while, you could just see my Vice-Chancellor's eyes light up. Iran and Iraq, partnership working in action, and for various reasons, neither project came to full fruition. So if changing structures or by itself isn't part of the solution, what are some of the things that might help? Well, the first thing I'd like to suggest to you is to really stress the importance of trying to understand what success would look like. It was the subtitle of tonight. If integration is the answer, what was the question? What are we actually trying to achieve? And my experience of working with public services around the country and beyond is that we're often very focused on processes and on structures. And we often start a debate about outcomes, and then we find that we've drifted subconsciously back into a discussion about processes and structures, often without realising that we've done it. And as I go around the country, people say to me, John, look, there's a problem, what do we do about it? Sometimes they say there's an opportunity, what do we do about it? But if I'm honest, they normally say there's a problem, what do we do about it? And they leap straight into a discussion about process and structure. What do we set up? What do we call it? Where does it sit? If you drew it on an organisational chart, where would be the straight line and where would be the dotted line? All important questions to answer in the fullness of time, but probably not the most important questions to begin with. And we use this slide as a way of trying to just park some of those process controversies, to say, well, look, what are you trying to achieve and for whom? And actually, how well does the current system do it at the moment? And slightly naively, I think I'd argue if we had a genuinely shared understanding of where we are now and a genuinely shared understanding of where we're trying to get to, the bit in between, what do we do, what do we set up, what do we call it, where does it sit, ought to be more straightforward. Or at the very least, we'd have some sort of success criteria against which we could judge the different options. As I said earlier, part of the difficulty is we start talking about outcomes and we drift back into process-based issues without realising that we've done it. And I worked with one health and social care community. It's probably one of the most integrated in the country. And they were adamant, using this slide, that the outcome they were trying to achieve for local older people was an integrated management team. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never met an older person that needs an integrated management team. It's just not an outcome. And even if it was, I think I'd argue it's not an outcome that matters to most older people that I've worked with anyway. An integrated management team is merely a process or a structure which might lead to much better and radically different outcomes for local older people. But equally, there might be 101 things that we could do that might be quicker, cheaper, better, less disruptive, or some sort of combination. And the second that having an integrated management team, in this example, becomes an end rather than just a means to an end, then actually this has become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We've lost sight of something really important in the process. So I would really commend this slide to you as a way just of trying to provide a bit of structure to some of those discussions and to guard against that danger of beginning to talk about outcomes but drifting back into process. And it's incredibly easy to do. I guarantee before the week is out, several people in this room at work will have started a discussion about outcomes and they'll have drifted back into a debate about process without realising that you've done it. I do it all the time, and it's my slide. If I can't apply my own slide to my own practice, then what can I do? It sounds deceptively simple, but actually being clear about what success would look like really is so important. And linking it back to the previous debate about structures, if we can be clear that the outcomes we're trying to achieve could be best achieved by major structural change, and if we're clear that that's the only or the best way of doing it, and if we're ready for the amount of upheaval and disruption it will cause, and we're still sure it's worth it, then in one sense a structural change could be part of that solution. But unless we're clear about what we're trying to achieve and about why that is the best way of going about trying to achieve those outcomes, then again we've lost sight of something really, really important in the process. Earlier I mentioned organisational and professional culture. And in professionally led services like health and social care, these are crucial. The top bullet point is a little bit out of date now, but was a director of social services that I worked with who was integrating quite a small group of social care staff into a much larger NHS mental health organisation. And he was running a consultation with staff. He'd been explaining it first, and I was going to go on afterwards and talk about the evidence base. And I was waiting in the wings as he was talking. And they gave him a real kicking. I mean, a real kicking. And he was really, really popular locally. And so I was waiting in the wings thinking, well, if they give him a real kicking, what's going to happen to me? And as he came off, I remember him saying to him, look, I understand why people are upset. I understand that change can be very threatening. But he said the bulk of the questions I got were about job security. And that's the bit that's clearly changed in the current financial context, because job security is very different now to how it was before 2008. He said, but it was almost as if we were trying to compete for need as a profession. He said, and we don't need to turn this into a competition for need. There's enough need to go around. Actually, the problem is there's too much need for us all to meet. There's enough misery, poverty, disability and distress for all of us. We don't need to compete for it. This is about change. It's unsettling. We've got to do it well. We've got to be clear we're doing it for the right reasons. But actually, let's not turn it back into a competition for need, because hand on heart, there is enough need to go around. And I do think that's a really, really important message. When I'm talking about these issues at a national level, if I haven't introduced myself well, then most audiences assume I'm a doctor. And they often assume I'm a medical doctor, not a proper doctor. I'm really glad we're filming this. And normally if you make a joke like that, they realise. And when it transpired that I was a social worker by background, all the social workers come up to me after coffee and they say, look, John, we're really worried that social care and social work is losing its identity and losing its potential contribution. It could get dominated by very medically focused health services in adult care, and it could get dominated by very attainment focused services in children's services alongside the education system. And it's really important, John, that people like you who speak about these events and research them try and preserve social care values. Now, in one sense, I fully agree, and a separate session could be, well, what are those values and so on. But I have to say that not many of those people who come up to me can tell me what those values are or why they really matter. And I hasten to add, social care is just a case study here for any one of the different professions that might be involved in interprofessional working. I find it quite a good example because it's my own professional background. But even as a former social worker, I've got no interest in preserving social care values just for the sake of preserving them. What's important is that all the professions involved in interagency working can feel really clear and confident about what they have to offer and about why it matters. And if we can do that, then actually working together could be an opportunity to share some of that contribution and maybe even to mainstream it, not a threat to our professional status and our professional contribution. And the negative findings in the mergers literature earlier is often to do with that sense of threat. It's feeling personally and professionally challenged and threatened by the changes. And it makes me take several steps back and more jealously guard what makes me a social worker and what makes you a nurse. And it takes me 12 to 18 months to feel sufficiently safe and confident again to take several steps forward and then to meet the other person halfway and to meet them as a person, not just as a stereotype of a particular professional background, and to ask questions and to start to challenge and to reflect on why I do things the way I do and what I think is important and so on. So actually I'm starting to come to the conclusion that having strong and well-led professions might be a really important building block for successful interprofessional working. And in one sense, you might have thought it might be the other way round. The stronger the individual profession, perhaps the harder it would be to bring us together. Maybe sometimes the more confident you feel about your professional contribution, the easier it might be to come together and to meet other people who are different from you halfway. The other thing that you can do in this situation is to be incredibly careful, particularly if you're in a very senior role, about the language that you use. Most people in senior roles realise quite quickly that they have very little influence on what goes on in their organisations. The only thing you can control ultimately is everything you say and everything you do, which makes everything you say and how you say it disproportionately important. And normally in these situations, when I'm working with different organisations in health and social care, somebody, and it's often a senior leader, will say sooner or later, what we're trying to do here is create a shared culture. And if you take anything away from tonight, my advice would be to never, ever, ever use the word shared culture. Our research suggests that when people say they want to create a shared culture, they might mean one of two different things. One is what we've called a melting pot approach, where you take a social worker, you take a nurse, you metaphorically melt them down, and you recast them as some sort of all-singing, all-dancing, generic professional. And sometimes when we say we're trying to create a shared culture, that's what we mean. Often we don't. We tend to mean a second model, which we've described as an orange juice with added vitamin C approach. You take what's good about a social worker, you take what's good about the nurse, you celebrate it, but actually you then enrich it and broaden it by bringing it into contact with other ways of seeing the world and other ways of doing things. And often when leaders say we're trying to create a shared culture, they mean orange juice with added vitamin C. A clinical audience will typically, though, hear melting pot approach. They automatically take 2 steps back, and you're back into that negative slide about the dangers of structural solutions and the dangers of mergers. So the kind of language that we use when we're framing these issues and trying to talk about them locally and work through them together is really, really important. And it's often very subtle and very nuanced, and if we don't reflect on it very carefully, it's really easy to lose sight of the importance of those issues. A final point I think I'd make under this particular slide is about how we try and recognise and value some of those professional differences as well as valuable in their own right. I worked with one of the early mental health care trusts, which were the first integrated health and social care organisations to be set up. A few years back, a minister said that in 5 years' time, all older people's services will be commissioned or provided by care trusts in England, single integrated organisations. At the height, there were only ever 12 out of 151 health and social care communities. We believed the minister, well actually we didn't, but and wrote a book on care trusts, and I have to say the royalties have been disappointingly meagre. But one of the early mental health care trusts was very conscious that it was trying to merge, again, quite a small group of social care staff into a broader NHS organisation. And it was worried that the staff would feel lost or abandoned or outnumbered in the new organisation. So they worked with them to say, well, what is it that you do and that you really value about your contribution? And what could you bring with you and help us develop in the new organisation? And the social workers chose various things, but one of the priorities that I identified was around anti-discriminatory practice. And so the Shadow Care Trust said, well, actually, we think that's really important in mental health services too, and we don't think we've been very good at it historically. Will you help us make it a real priority in the new organisation? And they insisted that all members of staff in the Care Trust went through compulsory anti-discriminatory practice training, both junior and senior staff, managers and clinicians. Now, going on a half-day discrimination workshop probably doesn't change your value base or your worldview overnight. In practical terms, it may have achieved nothing, for all I know. But in symbolic terms, it said something to those social workers. It said, there's something about what you do and what you value that we really value too. And we value it so much, we're going to build it into the warp and the weft of how we do things in this new integrated organisation. Now, that organisation still had to work through all the different issues that we've talked about. Some of those social workers would still have felt lost and outnumbered and abandoned at various stages. But by trying to work proactively and positively with issues of professional culture and professional difference, that Care Trust, I think, gave itself a chance of trying to minimise the negative impacts of merger and to try to get to new and better outcomes quicker and with less disruption than otherwise might have happened had they not been so attuned to the importance of these issues. A third thing that might help, and this is very underdeveloped, it's a personal view, is the importance for me of the personalisation agenda. In my work at the University of Birmingham, we focus a lot on direct payments, personal budgets and personal health budgets. And that agenda has really taken off in adult social care. It's developing in the NHS, but it is at a lot slower and at a relatively low level, I suspect, compared to the personalisation agenda in adult social care. These were both, although they've become national policy, both direct payments and personal budgets were actually invented very bottom up. Direct payments were invented by groups of quite campaigning disabled people who felt that if they had more choice and more control over the funding that went into their services, they could design better services and better support that would enable them to live more independent lives and to live their lives in the same way that non-disabled people live their lives. So although they've become official government health and social care policy, they actually began in a very unusual way, almost as a struggle for civil rights. And many of those early disabled campaigners were very influenced by similar civil rights campaigns around gender and around race. A lot of our efforts in policy as well have been about trying to join up health and social care and other systems as well, top down, by joining together management teams or budgets or organisational structures or legal frameworks. And that's got us so far, but probably only so far. If we had personal budgets and personal health budgets, I could imagine a kind of approach that enabled people with complex needs that span traditional boundaries, trying to find a way of working with those agendas to join up their own care and support, bottom up, in a way that works for them. And I suppose if we could get the top-down approach to integration with that bottom-up, more personalised approach, and if we could somehow find a way of it meeting in the middle, then we might really be motoring. Unfortunately, I don't see very much of that around the country as I travel round. It often feels as if we're developing a partnership agenda over here, and some of us are developing a personalisation agenda over here, and they happen separately from each other, rather than potentially trying to put them together as two sides of the same coin. And then a final slide before I try and conclude and then throw open to debate and to questions and to challenge and so on, is this one. And this is a little abstract, so if it's not helpful, please ignore it. It's written up in a number of academic articles and in some policy papers on the HSMC website. That's the Health Services Management Centre at the University of Birmingham. So for colleagues who are interested, there's some further thinking. But for some time, I and my colleagues have been arguing that we need to more fundamentally rethink the nature of the relationship between the NHS and the whole of local government. We've talked about it in terms of moving beyond joint commissioning, or sometimes we've called it creating NHS local. Now, by that, I don't mean that joint commissioning is unimportant. In many areas, it's crucial. But lots of places I visit, it feels sometimes as if the entirety of the relationship between health and local government is vested in a small number of individuals at a local level who've often got the words joint and commissioning somewhere in their title. And when you talk to them, most of those people never chose the job title. It got foisted on them in a previous reorganisation. And they feel incredibly lonely and isolated, trying to bring together two very different systems and to serve two different masters at once. And we've been arguing perhaps the time is right to more fundamentally rethink the nature of that relationship, so that really important ways of working like joint commissioning are a product of the relationship rather than the entirety of the relationship. And the argument runs as follows. My own belief is that local government needs the NHS now more than ever, not just because of the funding crisis that there is in local government. Local authorities have been tasked with promoting social and economic well-being and with being a strategic place shaper, which is a really odd phrase, but it means being the one organisation locally that's responsible for identifying and trying to nurture the unique identity of an area, making it a good place to live. And to do that, I think local government needs a significant relationship with local health services, because the quality of local health services is so important to so many different local people, from the cradle through to the grave. If we're not careful, you could end up with local councils responsible for well-being and for place shaping, with no influence over the one set of services that arguably matter most to most local people. So I think local government needs the NHS now more than ever. And my own view is that's relatively uncontroversial. If I had a local government audience in front of me, I don't know what they'd say, but I do think that's the case. Probably more controversially and more importantly, I think the NHS needs to learn from and work with the best of local government now more than ever, particularly when our finances are very challenged and when we have some really, really difficult decisions to make about the nature of future services. It's often said, stereotypically, that the NHS is good at making the right decision. We've got access to a lot of data in the NHS. We've got access to a lot of research and development. We've got a lot of analytical skills. We often don't think we have, but we really, really have, particularly when you compare us to other public services. It's also said, though, that local government is typically better at making decisions in the right kind of ways, in ways that engage people from the beginning and that try and give you the best chance of bringing those people with you as you make the decision and you try and implement it in practice. So if you give the NHS a decision to make, it will often make a very logical, very rational, very technically defensible decision, but it often won't pay attention to the politics of the decision, politics with a small p, till too late in the process, and sometimes that comes back to haunt us. So we've argued that the NHS needs to do that much better, and it needs to learn from and work with the best of local government. In one sense, it doesn't really matter what decision you take, actually. It's more about how you then work with people to implement the nature of the decision. It's as much about issues of local legitimacy and identity as it is the actual decision that you take. Now, in a previous era, when NHS organisations were tasked with being world-class commissioners, if you remember back to that agenda, a number of those primary care trusts were asked us, well, how will we know if we're world-class? And I remember saying, well, in one sense, if all you aspire to be is world-class, you're probably there already, because nobody anywhere in the world commissions systematically very well. So, but then realising that wasn't a very helpful response, we said, well, look, slightly tongue-in-cheek, you're a world-class commissioner if the next time you close an accident and emergency department or a maternity unit, you're a world-class commissioner if the local newspaper says, well, we either agree or we disagree with the decision that's been taken, but we recognise that that primary care trust is the locally legitimate organisation to make that very difficult decision on our behalves. It's as much about being seen as the locally legitimate organisation to take the decision as it is the actual decision that we take. With a national audience, we used to play a game as well. We'd ask NHS organisations, primary care trusts, how many of them had a headquarters on the edge of town and an industrial unit, not on a major bus route. And with a nationally representative audience, about a third to a half of NHS colleagues would normally put their hands up. You'd say, well, what's the first thing you see when you go into the headquarters? And I'll say, well, you see some photos of board members. A couple of the non-executives have been silhouetted out because we haven't been able to recruit, or they've left under a cloud. You say to local government colleagues, where are the council chambers? And in most areas of the country, not all, but in most, they're slap bang in the middle of town. The main shopping street runs normally right up to the front door. You can see the fountains and the statues and the domes for miles away. The first thing you see when you go in are oil paintings and those gold gilt frames of the mayors and the aldermen going back 300 years. You know, local government is often part and parcel of people's sense of place and their sense of identity, in a way that many of our NHS structures, which we change so frequently, often aren't. People might not necessarily understand local government, they might not necessarily like it, they might not necessarily vote for it, but often it's somehow part and parcel of our sense of place and our sense of identity in a way that many NHS structures aren't. I grew up in Devon, as I said at the start, and you could never merge Devon and Cornwall County Council. There'd be civil unrest on the streets of Truro if you tried to do it. There'd be more and bloodier wars fought over the River Tamar than anywhere else in the country. The reality is you could merge a Devon and Cornwall Primary Care Trust or a clinical commissioning group tomorrow, and relatively few people would notice. Now, that's an overstatement. It's clearly much more important and much more complicated than that. But I think there's a degree of truth in the caricature. So if the NHS needs local government now more than ever, and vice versa, isn't it time to more fundamentally rethink the nature of that relationship so that something like joint commissioning and the different manifestations of joint working that we have are products of that relationship rather than the entirety of the relationship? And going back to where I started with the Beveridge Report in 1942, I think if we could do this, if we could move beyond joint commissioning, if we could create NHS local, whatever that looks like or feels like for you, actually I think we'd transform welfare services in this country like we did in 1942 with the Beveridge Report. I think if we could genuinely do this, we'd be an international example of good practice in terms of welfare reform once again, like we were in 1942 with the Beveridge Report. But probably most importantly of all, if we could genuinely do this, we'd end up with health and social care services that are so close to what people want and what people actually need that, like the Beveridge Report in 1942, we get people talking about it again on your equivalent of a Clapham omnibus. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jon. That's fascinating. Yes, the floor is open. We'll open for discussion straight away. Any comments? Suggestions?
I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
For lots of reasons, but this is the devil's advocate question. So I did genuinely mean I needed children. I recognise that rush to sort out structures and processes when actually you need a conversation about where do we want to be. And I sense that in your last slide, that's what you do. You're doing what you said. I have to be careful of. You're kind of coming back. So classically, local authorities, etc., etc. And in the present climate, the development of city regions, I guess, adds to that dilemma too. Do we get caught up in thinking about that?
Yeah.
Not far away from here in Manchester, they're devolving health and social care budgets. So right from the get-go, it's around structures and implications, rather than a reverse conversation.
Yeah.
Which is
that's exactly it. I mean, that is the real danger and the opportunity in the current context. You've hit the nail exactly on the head. If we're not careful, that final slide could do everything I said in the previous slides doesn't work. And devolution at its worst could be 2 or 3 years of working out governance structures and not much else. However, if we did the other stuff and approached it the other way around, it could be something genuinely different. And we've often felt in healthcare in particular that we've tried to change practice and tried to change services in a number of different ways. Sometimes we've tried to do it by the power of ideas. We've just told people that it would be better if you do things like this. I'd love to think that works, given I work at a university, I ought to be into the power of ideas, but just telling people that stuff would be better just doesn't do it for me often. For years we've been saying the NHS would be better if doctors were nicer to their patients. We issue circulars saying it would be better if you were nicer to your patients. Every now and again we say, please be nicer to your patients. My experience is nice doctors are already really nice to their patients, and not very nice doctors aren't that nice to their patients. And me telling them they ought to be nicer doesn't really change their behaviour. It's a flippant example, but I think it's an important one. We sometimes try and do it through changing the structures, and actually that often looks big and bold and dramatic, as if you're sweeping away the old and ushering in the new. It often makes it worse rather than better in the short to medium term, and it gives a false impression of change. We sometimes do it by trying to change the incentives, and that can be really powerful, but incentives are so powerful sometimes that if you don't design it really well, you can very easily have unintended consequences and incentivise the wrong thing. So that is potentially really exciting, but really difficult to do well. I suppose my final slide about NHS Local takes you into a debate about, well, what would happen if we changed the accountabilities? To whom do workers feel accountable? And actually, could we tweak or play with to whom people feel accountable as a way of trying to change behaviour? Is there anyone here from Carlisle, out of interest? Excellent. Every 3 or 4 years, there's a story about NHS dentistry on the news and how difficult it is to access an NHS dentist in some parts of the country. And for reasons I've never understood, the footage is always of people queuing to sign up with the last NHS dentist, and it's always in Carlisle. I've got no way of knowing whether the particular issues around dentistry in Carlisle that don't exist elsewhere in the country. I suspect it's the same footage, and every 3 or 4 years we just drag it out again, but we haven't had one for a while, so we're probably due one. I guarantee there'll be one, and when there is, it'll be Carlisle. And part of me watches that and thinks, well, why is that? And in my day job, I understand some of the technicalities of that. It's because it's really difficult. But actually, it's been like that for years, and it's not changed. And is that partly because some of the people responsible aren't actually directly accountable to some of the people who it directly affects? If it was a local council that was responsible for that, heads would roll and the administration would change, whether or not the people could actually do anything about it. So I wonder whether there's something slightly more powerful, not focusing on the structures, although structures may change as a result, not just focusing on the power of ideas, partly playing around with some of the incentives, but actually thinking about the accountabilities. To whom do we feel accountable? And if you're a hospital doctor, it's a really difficult question. To whom are you accountable? You're accountable to your patients, you're accountable to your colleagues, you're accountable to your discipline and to your Royal College, you're accountable to your chief executive. You've got quite a complex mix of accountabilities there. The same is true for academics as well, actually. So maybe just thinking about this in terms of accountability is a slightly different way into a discussion that often becomes structural if we're not careful. So go back now.
Yes, thank you. It's a very interesting and wide-ranging aspect of the industry itself, whether health or local authority. But my comment or observation, maybe question and comments, in terms of the last part of your presentation on the organizational culture. Following the PCT, Primary Care Trust Decommissioning, it's split into two bodies. The Clinical Commissioning Group, CCGs, and Public Health. Public Health went to the local authority. Although there are different cultures with the local authority, specialized in social care, adult care, not quite with the NHS. Right. You see these views, you put time scale of 18 months. I don't think, in my opinion, maybe my observation, it has not delivered the awareness, the information, whether diabetes, health, mental health, while the CCG is still active in the NHS. Do you think this restructure was really good? And what is the outcome after this?
I mean, it is really early days and it's really difficult to tell, and I suspect it will vary quite dramatically around the country. If I'm honest, as a private individual, of all the elements of the reforms, the public health changes were the ones that I was most optimistic and most upbeat about. Not necessarily because I thought they would have immediate impacts, but because just that potential for us to bring the skills and the analysis and the expertise of public health practitioners alongside some of the broader functions that we have in local government, particularly around economic development, around education, around regeneration, some of the place-based initiatives, I do think is genuinely exciting. I think local government could benefit from some of those skills and that discipline. I think actually public health could have a much greater influence because it's got those relationships. Now, whether or not it's actually possible to do that within a local area depends on a range of contextual factors. It's also happened in an incredibly challenging policy context and financial context, and it may be that the finances have undermined the potential to actually do that. But I did think that at least in principle it opened up a route into those notions of broader partnerships, because a lot of the debate has been about the relationship between health and social care. And that's important, and that relationship has sometimes been difficult. But one of the ironies is that health and social care often have a lot more in common with each other than social care does with other local authority directorates, ironically enough. So actually there's something about the breadth of those partnerships that could be really exciting. Whether we can harness it in the current financial context, I think, is the challenge. There was a hand here, I think.
A social worker as well, but currently I was implementing the Care Act, but they've decided to give me the Better Care Fund as well. So I'm currently, for the past month maybe, I've suddenly become accountable to NHS England to fill lots of boxes in and meet lots of requirements in their plans. As part of lots of people in Blackpool who are filling in other boxes for NHS England for sustainability and transformation plans and things like that. And I wondered how you thought that all fits in with going forwards, really, because to me it's we've got teams filling in STP plans, the Vanguard proposition, the Better Care Fund, all. Yeah,
it's certainly a very hyperactive policy context, I think I'd call it. And in one sense it's always been thus, or there have been peaks and troughs in that. I don't want to minimise the difficulty of that because it's clearly incredibly complex. But I suppose the only way of coming through that, I suspect, is if we've got a genuinely shared sense of what success would look like for the people of Blackpool. And that might be different for what success would look like for the people of somewhere else. We've still got to work with all the complexity of those different governance systems and that repetition and the overlay of those different initiatives and how we make sense of that. But we've got no chance at all of making sense of it if we don't know what we're trying to achieve together. Having some kind of shared understanding of what success would look like, at the very least allows us to say, well, hang on, how do we do all these individual things that we have to do? And yes, we do have to account for them, and yes, sometimes that's very clunky. But actually, how do we do that in a way that delivers what we were trying to deliver in the first place for the people of Blackpool? I'm not saying it's easy, because it clearly isn't, but unless you've got that sense of what success would look like, we can't even get started. So that narrative, I think, is important. And for senior colleagues in particular, who've probably been through a number of different versions of this, there's something really important about public service leadership, which we describe as being about sense-making. It's about receiving some of this, and people are public servants that are responsible for implementing what they've received from locally and nationally elected policy makers. But there's something about receiving it, about understanding what it's about, and then interpreting it and adapting it for local context in a way that would best work for the people of Blackpool in this particular case. It's a really important and often unspoken function of sense-making on behalf of the local area. And again, that's really difficult to do unless you've got a shared sense of what you're trying to achieve. So I do think it takes you back into what are the outcomes. We've got to do these 3 or 4 different things that look kind of the same. Actually, how could we best do them in a way that maximises our chance of delivering those outcomes? Unless you know what those outcomes are, you're just going to do 3 or 4 different versions of the same thing without getting any further forward.
Thank you. You mentioned in one of the slides the local government is the one supposed to be engaged in legitimacy. Do you think the local differences in politics could influence that? For example, local councils influences in politics, Labour, Conservative, or do you think can influence the engagement and the...
Yeah. Well, that's one of the complexities of creating integrated organisations. Local government is inherently political with a small p, and it's often inherently party political as well. That can be a real culture shock from NHS organisations who are used to dealing with some of the national politics, but historically haven't been as exposed to some of those local party political differences. One of the reasons why public health specialists may have found it difficult is because their role shifted from being a champion for public health to being an advisor, but also having to be quite politically savvy in a local government sense in order to fulfil that championship type roles. We did quite a lot of work around the country with different health and social care partnerships, and the time I got most excited was in a big local authority where we brought the elected councillors together with officers, and we brought some of the lead GPs together with some of their CCG officers. Many of those people hadn't met each other before, which was interesting in itself. But once they did meet each other, they found that the councillors and the GPs often had more in common with each other than either of them did with their own officials. And that was partly because they were both so rooted in a sense of local place. The councillor had often been the councillor representing that ward for many, many years. And in addition to, or by virtue of being the councillor, they were often on the chair of governors at the local school, and they were the president of the Boy Scouts, and they were involved in the life of the community. The GP had often lived and owned property and worked in that community for generations, and it had seen different generations of the same families come through over time. They had a really strong and quite exciting sense of local place. And they started to get quite excited about what could you do if you could bring that commitment to local place together. And actually, if you could tie that in with neighbourhood policing and with regeneration and with children's centres and with federations of schools and so on, what could you do on a local basis? The challenge, I think, for those particular groups of people was how do you do that really important locally based work whilst also taking a more regional or larger view for the reconfiguration of specialist surgical interventions or hospital reconfiguration, what have you. How do you do both at the same time? So there is an inherent political element to local government, but those are the locally elected people. And actually they're often rooted in a sense of local place, which could be really exciting in an NHS context.
Can I just ask you something about the alternative, just briefly? And you hinted at that, and sorry probably for reducing the nuances and subtleties now radically. You hinted at personalisation. Oh yeah. And what is fascinating about personalisation is also that a certain philosophy sort of underpins personalisation. Philosophy often was sort of like individual with individual responsibilities and a good view of personal needs as well, and a good understanding of that, but also the limitations, because some of the patients clearly can't fulfill these and can't meet these requirements. I'm just thinking of people with learning disabilities who simply struggle even to understand their own needs, etc., etc. So I wonder how far this alternative takes us really to get away from process and restructuring into real good outcome orientated.
Yeah, well, I mean, personalisation is often portrayed, and sometimes indeed can be, quite individual. There's a political view that this is about individual responsibility, it's about individual choice, it's a consumerist model. At the same time, there's a completely different political tradition that says actually this is about citizenship, it's about choice and it's about control, it's about rights and entitlement. It's often come from a civil rights campaigning type background. And part of the difficulty is it's possible for people to like personalisation for very, very different underlying political reasons. And you think you're talking about the same thing, but it's only when you get part way through that you realise you've got very different notions of what's going on here. But at its most simple, personal budgets and adult social care are nothing more complicated than being clear with the person from day one, roughly how much money is available to spend, and then having a more creative conversation about, well, how could we best spend that money? It's really about trying to make sure that decisions that really matter to people are made as close as possible to the people that the decision affects, ideally by the person themselves. But if it can't be the person themselves for whatever reason, then by somebody who knows the person well and who cares about them. Now that could easily be me working with a social worker, that could be me working with a family member, it could be me working with a broker. It could be me talking to other disabled people in the area and thinking things through a system of peer support. It could be all kinds of different things, but by trying to be a little clearer about the money, there's scope to be a little bit more creative, both for the worker and for the individual. So I actually think this works better for people with quite profound learning disabilities, with fluctuating mental health problems, people with dementia, profoundly disabled children and others, potentially, than some of our directly provided services, because when we design it well, and clearly that's the trick, and when we stay true to the underlying value base and the ethos, and that's the other trick, actually it gives us scope to tailor support more fully to individual needs. And in the health service, we've suggested a number of tests for when you ought to think about these kind of approaches. One is, when would it make a difference if the person had the genuine flexibility to be creative? And in many areas of healthcare, it makes no difference. If you've got problem X, you sometimes just need Y. We could think of quicker or better ways of getting you Y, but if you've got X, you just need Y. There's no point trying to develop personalised approaches. Secondly, when would it make a difference if the person kind of had the flexibility to sort of turn that into practical action, into something that potentially looks different to traditional services? When is there something that's so personal to me that the way that I go about meeting it might, what would work for me might be fundamentally different to what you would need. If you're recovering from a mental health problem, I don't think we know very much actually about what helps people to recover from serious mental ill health. Actually, some of what works for me might be very different to what works for you. So actually personalisation is potentially a really fruitful avenue there. And the third one is, when is the process almost more important than the outcome? When having something that's truly personal to you is so crucial that actually it's almost more important than the outcome. And I guess a very controversial example there is in end-of-life care, where actually in one sense the outcome is preordained. By definition, it's the process by which you arrive at the outcome that's so fundamental to whether or not something is a good service or is a good experience or not, if that doesn't sound strange in such a setting. So I think there's loads of areas of health that would really benefit for this, areas of long-term condition, palliative care, services for disabled children, some mental health services, finally closing some of our learning disability campuses and so on. There's equally large swathes of the NHS where it wouldn't work at all and there'd be no point trying. So I think it's more about thinking through what's the outcome we're trying to achieve and then in what kind of areas would this be fruitful. I don't think it'll happen, if I'm honest, in a systematic way, because it feels quite counter-cultural, but I do think there's some really exciting bottom-up, often quite small-scale things happening around the country that's really, really genuinely exciting and is allowing people sometimes to navigate with support across the different boundaries that we found so difficult to join up by trying to do it top-down. Yeah.
Conscious of the time, so it remains for me to thank you, Jon, for a fascinating
Not at all.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks very much.